Hello. Welcome to the X-linked recessive video. In this video, we're going to talk about how we can tell if a trait of concern is inherited via X-linked recessive mode of inheritance, right? So, like we said, we cannot prove if the mode of inheritance is actually X-linked recessive, but we can use the following criteria to see and eliminate other modes of inheritance, such as autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked dominant, Y-linked, etc., right? So let's just do that. So the first criteria is that males will generally be affected more than females. So let's just write that down. Males will generally be affected more than females. And like previous cases, we would explore each of these after we have listed them out. The second criteria is that it is possible for the trait that is inherited via X-linked recessive to skip a generation, and this is also similar to autosomal recessive, right? You can also could skip a generation, the trait, right? Or they could may not skip. It really depends. Whereas in X-linked dominant and autosomal dominant, the trait cannot skip a generation. All right, so let's just write that down. Trait cannot skip a generation. So number 3, what is number 3? It is that the affected father will pass the allele to his mother and not the son. Therefore, there is no male-to-male transmission, right? No male or affected male or unaffected male, but in this case it's a trait of concern, so it will be affected male. No male to male transmission. And we explore why this was the case because son will get the Y chromosome from his father, and the trait of concern here is X-linked recessive. Therefore, there is no allele responsible for our trait of concern that's present on the Y chromosome, right? It's only on the X chromosome. Obviously, there are alleles on the Y chromosome, but they are not responsible for our trait of concern. E.g., do you have color blindness or do you not, right? Number 4 is that if the mother is affected, that the sons would also be affected. So let's just write that down. If the mother is affected, then the sons will be affected. Then the sons will be affected. Awesome. And why is this the case? Well, we'll see later on. Number 5 is that the affected sons may not have an affected mother. The affected sons may not have an affected mother. Whereas this is different from the case of X-linked dominant, because the affected sons must have an affected mother, right? Because the sons gets his X chromosomes from the mother. Whereas in this case, it's recessive, so therefore the mother could be heterozygous, like capital A, little a, right? And capital A overrides the little a, the recessive allele, which in this case, X-linked recessive. Therefore, the mother who's heterozygous would not exhibit the recessive trait that we are concerned about. And we'll explore this in more detail after we finish listing. And I think this is the last one, which is that the affected mother's father must be affected. And we'll explore why this is the case later. So let's just explore one by one first. So let's just see how a trait cannot skip a generation if it's X-linked recessive, similar to autosomal recessive. So let's just draw a pedigree here. like so. And let's just say that he marries to a female and they have 2 children, and one of the children is affected, right? Or in this case, the son. Does not really matter. And here you can see that the trait skipped a generation, right? So let's explore. Since this is X-linked recessive, is this possible? Since it's recessive, the genotype of the father must be capital A. And why? Why is this the case? Because if the father has the little a allele, then he would be affected because is X-linked recessive, and he only has 1 X chromosome. Whereas in the mother's case, the mother's unaffected, therefore she can have 2 genotypes, right? Capital A, or she can also have this genotype combination. Capital A, little a, right? She will be unaffected in this case. Unaffected. And in the above scenario, she would also be unaffected. Right? And the fathers would also be unaffected. So let's just draw the second Punnett square here for the unaffected father, because again, these 2 parents are unaffected. And these are the possible genotypes for them. And let's just do the crossover, right? So we have capital A, capital A, capital A, capital A, capital A as well for both daughters, and also capital A and Y for both sons. And in the second scenario where the mother is heterozygous, we have the following possibilities for the offsprings. We have this and that. Oops, this should be lowercase a. So there we go. So again in exam you should draw a table like this. I'll just do it for one of them. And obviously it should be a straight line. You should be using a ruler like that. And obviously you should not include these lines, right? Because it's not an actual table if you include those. And make sure that the table is sealed off. They are really nicky picky about these. So yeah, you just don't want to lose 1%, because 1 out of 100 is 1% of your marks. Anyways, so in this case, no offsprings could be potentially affected, right? Because X-linked recessive, it must has and exhibit the little a allele, right? In this case, the little a allele does not even exist because the parents don't have little a, right? So therefore, we cannot change the father's genotype. We could change the mother's genotype. So therefore, this cannot be a possibility, right? The other possibility of the mother is this genotype, capital A, little a, right? It's still unaffected, as shown in the pedigree. Unaffected mother. And the father, as we have said, this is the only genotype for the father. And yes, it is possible to have affected offsprings using this genotype combination, right? 100% of the daughters are not affected. Unaffected. Oops, let me just make some more room here. And 50% of the sons are affected. Right? And as we can see here, the son is affected, so that's fine. So this would be the genotype of the parents, right? The mother would be, you're going to use a different color. Let's use that. So the mother would be heterozygous, capital A, little a, and the father would be capital A, right? Because they're both unaffected. So in this case, you can see that it is possible to skip a generation, right? This generation did not have the trait, F1, whereas the F2 generation had the trait, you know, from no trait, from the parents having no trait to the children having trait, so it skipped the generation. And like we have said in the other scenario, even though if this, just say these 2 are affected, and F2 has the affected offspring is still considered skipping generation, because these two parents are what gives the alleles to these two offsprings, and these two parents are unaffected, therefore it's still considered a skipping of generation, despite these two in F1 being affected, because these two individuals does not give their alleles to these individuals or offsprings in F2 generation. Alrighty, so now let's just look at the third criteria, where there's no male to male transmission. Well, this is obvious, right? Because we already said it in X-linked dominant, where the father can only pass on the Y chromosome to his sons, and so the sons will only get the trait of concern present on the X chromosome from the mother, because the mother gives the X chromosomes to his sons. So that was already explored in X-linked dominant, so we're not explored here. It's the same thing. In criteria number 4, if the mother is affected, then all sons will be affected. Well, let's have a look if this is the case or not using some Punnett square diagrams. So the mother is affected. In this case, it is X-linked recessive. Therefore, the mother can only have one possibility, right? It can only be little a, right? Because it's X-linked. Recessive. Therefore, if the mother has a capital A allele, then she would not be affected. And what was the criteria again? If the mother is affected, then the sons will be affected. So let's just see. Let's just say that the father is unaffected. Let's see what happens. An affected mother with an affected father, we should expect, using criteria number 4, that all sons will be affected. Let's see. Indeed, all the sons are affected, but the daughters are unaffected though. However, let's just see what happens if the father is affected and the mother is affected. Let's just use the same color here. So affected mother, keep that constant, and let's just say the father is affected as well. Let's see what happens. That shape of Y. So the same principle from principle 4 applies. If the mother is affected, all the sons are affected, right? And also all the females are affected. But what's consistent between these two cases is that whether the father is affected or not, as long as the mother is affected, all the sons are guaranteed to be affected, right? The only difference of whether the females are affected would depend on the father being affected or not. So in this case, the father is unaffected, then no females are affected. In this case, all females would be affected. So number 4 is that regardless of the father's genotype, affected or unaffected, if the mother is affected, then all sons would be affected. Alright, so let's go look at the second last one. Affected sons may not have an affected mother. Let's just see how this is the case. So let's just do a Punnett square again. We have X and X, X and X, X and Y, X and Y. So if the mother is a carrier, let's see what happens. Right? So if the mother is a carrier and the father is, let's just say, affected. Capital A, little a, little a, little a, capital A, little a. So in this case, the mother's unaffected, the father's affected, however, the sons are affected. And 50% of the sons are affected, 50% of the daughters are affected. Let's just see what happens if the father's unaffected and the mother's a carrier. Oops. We can see here that none of the daughters are affected. However, 50% of the males are affected. right? Whereas none of the females are affected, and the mother's unaffected. So the mother's unaffected, the father's unaffected, however 50% of the males are affected. Therefore, what's similar between these two cases is that the mother's unaffected, the father could be affected or not, but in each of these cases, 50% of the males are affected, despite the father being affected or unaffected, right? As long as the mother is unaffected. So that's a criteria. Affected sons may not have an affected mother. Number 6 is that affected mother's father must be affected. So let's just see how's that the case. You have an affected mother, right? Like this. So the mother will receive one X chromosome from her mother, right? And she will receive one X chromosome from her father. In this case, the affected mother has two A alleles because she cannot have a capital A allele. If she has a capital A allele, she would be unaffected, right? Because we're dealing with X-linked recessive here. And since she inherits one X chromosome from her father and it is little a, her father must have a genotype of this X little a Y, and in this case the father would be affected. Therefore, if the mother or any daughters are affected, the father must be affected. Correct? So that's criteria number 6. It was that if a daughter or a mother is affected, the father must be affected. Because daughters have 2 X chromosomes, inherits 1 X chromosome from the father, and in order for the daughters to be affected, it's a recessive trait. Therefore, the both X chromosomes must be little a, and if the father passes on a little a, then he will be affected. And lastly, we'll talk about Y-linked, which is really simple. Y-linked is just basically the trait being inherited via Y chromosome. And if you remember, males have X and Y chromosomes, females in X and X. Therefore, if a trait is Y-linked, therefore is passed on via the alleles present on the Y chromosomes, it would only affect males, right? Because females do not inherit Y chromosomes. Therefore, if you see a pedigree where only males are affected, you would think about it is either Y-linked or X-linked recessive, because as you have seen here in the above scenarios, males are more likely to be affected than females. So if the criteria of X-linked recessive does not satisfy, you could be thinking about Y-linked. So just as a recap, if the trait affects genders equally, it will probably be autosomal inheritance, right? Dominant or recessive, and probably not X-linked. However, we said that in X-linked dominant, that the trait usually have equal chance of affecting males and females. However, that may not be true if the mother is heterozygous, right? So it will depend on the question, and you will need to draw Punnett squares. So if the trait only affects males and does not satisfy all of the criteria that we have mentioned for X-linked recessive, it is Y-linked. So that's it for this video. In the next video, we'll go through some pedigree questions. We'll analyze and put what we have learned into practical use. Okay, so see you then.